The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to continue the series that I started with Harold Evans of Orenda Technologies. In this episode, we're going to go over scaling in your pool. We're going to go over some of the things you can do to prevent the scaling of your surface and some of the reasons why your surface may be rough to the touch. Leslie's Pool Supplies is a proud partner of the Pool Guy Podcast Show. Leslie's Pool Supplies has been do-it-yourselfers and pool trade professionals' trusted partner since 1963, providing quality products and services to make pool care easy and solutions and expertise to do it right. So I'm joined again by Harold Evans of Orenda Technologies. Okay, so this is one thing that is really big in the industry now, and much bigger than it was several years ago, and it's the scaling and metal staining in the pools. And we'll also touch on your startup process that you've pretty much invented, right, from scratch.
Part of a collaboration. I think it's a common sense approach, and when we get through talking about it, I hope your audience will see how clear an understanding they'll have about it. I think our contribution to startup will probably be one of the most profound things that I was able to do, or we were able to do, for the entire pool industry. I think it's a game changer how startup can affect the life of the surface and the preservation of our equipment and all the things that go with it. So it's exciting times for me.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the podcast. But let's start with the scaling of a pool. I know Orenda is really focused on the LSI index, and it's something that industry-wide I don't think has been a big focus. However, I've noticed in the last few years, especially with some new pool builds that I take over, that the scaling is really unreal in some cases as far as the plaster scaling. And I think a lot of it has to do with different things. We'll touch on the startup again. But the scaling of a pool surface and then metal staining is also a big issue that we're finding in the industry. And with homeowners, I get a lot of emails. Homeowners will send me a photo of their pool surface and ask me what this actually is on their pool, what stain this is, and things of that nature. Some will also email me saying that their kids' hands and feet are cut when they're swimming, and it's becoming a big issue, and they're not sure what's going on. So let's talk about this problem that's happening in the industry with scaling and metal staining.
Well, I do want to talk about that. So it's kind of interesting. We use the word scaling as a universal statement, but in fact, the discussion of scaling is a very, very much more complicated than that. So when you talk about that 60 grit sandpaper feeling on a surface, in most cases, those conditions are not scaling at all. Those conditions are the reverse of scaling. It's the low LSI. So let's just back up and say this. The Langelier Saturation Index, called the LSI, or the saturation index, if you want to, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, it's very old technology. This goes back to the early 1900s. And it had to do with maintaining boilers and understanding the formation of scale or the corrosiveness of water. So it's a universal, 100% non-biased scientific approach to understanding corrosion on the one side, on the left side, and scale formation on the right side, and the balance in between. All the phenomena of scaling, or what we call scaling, are explained by the LSI. So the reason we teach the LSI so implicitly is it is the stopwatch for understanding the condition that we manage. So let's talk about the two different conditions. What you think is scaling, in many cases, can be something very different. So in a plaster startup, it's also involved in that discussion. But I would say this, that in many cases, scaling is misunderstood. And in fact, what you see is the byproduct of a low LSI and the fact that there's been a transfer or degradation of the surface because of a low saturation index and not a high. So a high saturation index creates scale. A low saturation index causes etching. And so essentially it's the practice of either forming a coating of calcium carbonate on something or actually pulling the properties of calcium out of the wall, which a plaster surface is largely compressed calcium, and pulling that calcium out of the wall and causing this damage. The other way that can be done, or where you'll see people be injured by the surface of a pool, is by acid washing, and that's another subject matter entirely. But so what we've learned through research and through time is that um, a, a lot of the sheeting that we see in a surface that we think is scale is in fact low LSI efflorescence and the transfer of calcium hydroxide from a wall. So in a pool wall chemistry, not to go too deep with this, there's two forms of calcium essentially that we're talking about here. One is calcium hydroxide and the other is calcium carbonate. Okay. Carbonate is scale. Hydroxide is a part of the makeup. What's in the plaster is the softest, most quick to dissolve part of the surface. And when we freshly plaster a pool, there's dust that we see that we've come to accept as part of the experience of having a plastered pool. And in fact, that's really proven to be evidence of failure because basically what's happening on fill is that the water seeks equilibrium and water wants to be saturated. And when we have water, and by the way, most of the water across this country, including places that people think the calcium levels are higher than they are, I would say it's a universal statement that's pretty safe to say that in the vast majority of the cases across the country, most of the water is calcium deficient by pool plaster standards and by pool equipment standards. And so water seeks to equalize one way or the other and seek balance in the water one way or the other. So if you have calcium deficient water and a freshly plastered pool, it's going to seek the lowest form of calcium out of that wall to equalize and to seek equilibrium. And so that calcium hydroxide, which is the term for dust, is the same. They're the same thing. And so when we see hazing on a wall, a lot of times what that can be, or we call modeling, that is actually the presence of calcium hydroxide that came out of especially a colored surface that leads us to believe that it's scaling. It's not. It's the calcium hydroxide was pulled out of the wall and it covers that surface and distorts the color of that surface, which creates this appearance. We've always had this problem. It's just that white plastered pools didn't show this problem historically because they were obviously white in nature. Calcium hydroxide is white in nature. So colored surfaces have brought to the forefront this condition that we've probably always had. In fact, not probably, we have always had. So it's important that we understand that the makeup of plaster at startup is that in this fragile incubation period of startup, a pool plaster the hydroxide wants to convert to carbonate. And if given the right conditions, it's allowed to hydrate properly, then it's going to harden and become that impervious product that we seek. And so the bottom line is that if we don't equalize the water to begin with, the water will equalize itself through the surface. And that transfer of that material then dissolves into the water chemistry, and you get a rise in calcium that essentially is the water trying to equalize with the surface. So it's important that what we do at Orenda at our startup called the barrel startup is basically we oversaturate the water with calcium from the first drop of water that touches the plaster. And if we did that alone, it could scale because we would have a saturation index violation by nature of oversaturating the water. So we put our chelate, SC1000, that doesn't have a low pH and aggressive nature to etch, and we allow that calcium. And so chelation is like putting on a rubber glove. It allows calcium to remain in the water and not electrically bond to itself to form carbonate. So that's what happens when you have a chelate in the water, is that rich calcium is not allowed to cluster together and to stay in its form to allow the hydration of the surface to not pull that surface out, because there's enough calcium in the water, and that's what it wants, is balance. And so by chelating that calcium, we oversaturate the water, and then at fill, according to the National Plaster Council, and it's pretty widely accepted by all corners in this industry, they want a minimum of 200 hardness. So if the average the average tap water in America I've measured is 80 or less, then obviously getting to 200, the only way it's going to happen is through the surface. So by oversaturating the water, the surface doesn't donate its body parts, and there's no dust in the pool. Aside from being a nuisance, which all pool professionals know they hate about startups, it's also damaging the surface because this is microscopically pulled out of the wall. And so if you were to put it under a microscope, you'd see a surface that couldn't, that would have little potholes in it all over the place. And that's going to be the places where that surface is going to begin to compromise. Well, if it was left alone and it was cured properly, then it would harden those places, and that surface would remain smoother and more impervious over time. And one of the practices that I hugely disagree with is the acid startup process, where they're burning this dust and they're burning the surface essentially to try to get an appearance early on that it looks good. And the problem is that hydroxide needs to harden in that wall and stay in that wall and not be burnt up. And over time, aggressive water is going to cause this modeling to come out later. So what looks good today is going to look bad over time. The razor wire type feeling in a surface that you were talking about in your received emails tends to be a cold weather climate factor that happens because of low LSI in the winter. The most neglected factor in the saturation index is the recognition of water temperature. Water temperature is a huge corrosion factor in controlling water. And this is not new science. This is believed by wastewater treatment, by drinking water treatment plants, by recreational water. No one disagrees about the saturation index. So what ends up happening is in the winter climates, especially in the Northeast and other places where it's colder, the problem is that water, as it drops in temperature, tries to seek equilibrium in the same way we've talked about in saturation. So if you have a low LSI water and you begin to get colder, it gets lower. And the lower that saturation index goes, the more it wants to pull something from the surface. So what ends up happening is that razor feeling that you have is nothing more than calcium coming out of the wall and trying to equalize. And as the water temperature warms up, those crystals form on the wall. And those are crystals of calcium that are on that wall that create that abrasion feeling. And it's a very large problem that is now being investigated by the NPC, of the Plaster Council, and others. But it's a complex problem. Scaling and etching in some cases are being called the same thing, and they're not. And it's important that we understand that the saturation index is the stopwatch that explains these phenomena. So if you scale a pool, you can fix it with additive products that we sell and others do that can just put this calcium back in solution. But once you etch a pool, you're permanently damaging forever that surface. So a low LSI is something that you want to avoid at all costs. But most of the damage that happens in a swimming pool, both equipment and in surface, and we teach this in our seminars, we actually train with two of the major manufacturers in our country, Pentair and Jandy, or Fluidra as they're called today. We're actually teaching in their universities these days about saturation index and how important it is to the preservation of equipment and surfaces. So scale formation can be removed. Now, in the case of a heater, that's a more complex problem, because if you have scale forming in a heater over time, it's more difficult. It can actually affect the performance of the heater. But understanding the saturation index will explain most corrosion, most heat exchanger erosion, most equipment damage that can be explained by saturation index. So it's a somewhat complex subject, and it's a somewhat modern subject, but it really isn't. It's been something that's been going on for a very long time. We're at the forefront of trying to help these plaster surfaces early on not be exposed to low LSI conditions, which results in permanent damage to that surface, to that very expensive surface that you've put on. So doing acid startups will postpone the appearance of this problem, but it will ultimately never go away. So, in my opinion, if we manage this saturation index correctly in the first place, when we allow that calcium to cure in the wall properly, life's going to be a lot better for that surface. It's going to look a lot better. There's going to be less nuisance at startup. And in the end, the customer's going to get a much higher quality product that they've paid a lot of money for in the first place, and not have huge customer relations issues that plaster problems create in our industry, to the point that we've created a plaster council in our industry to identify consumer dissatisfaction. So it's a very large problem. It's a separate problem in a way from metal staining, even though calcium is a metal. We'll talk about staining in another light, but in the totality of calcium, in the totality of understanding the preservation and warranty of your equipment and your surface, saturation index, and that's why it's the forefront of our app, is a critical mechanism for explaining and understanding why we have the conditions that we have. It's like a stopwatch for the speed of aggression in water or the forming of scale in water.
Basically, I know that was a pretty long statement by you, and just want to highlight a couple points for the listener. A lot of the scaling is again caused by corrosive or aggressive water, correct?
Yeah, so terminology wise, it isn't scaling, it's etching. So
Yeah.
what appears to be scaling is really etching, and they look the same in some to the person that isn't trained, but the reality is they're very, very, very different outcomes. So we can't call it scaling because that's not what it is. It's a
Yeah.
transfer of chemistry from the surface, and scaling forms on the surface. So what we're
Got it.
pulling out of the wall is very different than what we coat the wall with.
You mentioned your app. I think that's probably the best thing that someone could use to see why their pool has, we'll just use the word scale or etching, why it has that. And so if they're doing the LSI and it shows that the water is being aggressive, that's probably etching versus the scaling, which would be if the water has too much calcium, right?
Right. So what ends up happening, unfortunately, is our industry is in the habit of using acid as a remedy for so many things. And obviously, if you have a low LSI condition and you falsely identify it as a scale, then you think the solution is acid, which is crazy because it's quite the contrary. Let me just say this to the listener. It's really important, if this is of an interest to you, to go to our app and keyword search these topics and watch the videos. The concepts are somewhat complicated and they're kind of involved, but it's important that you could listen to this more than once, I think, to begin to understand and explain these situations that you have. They're somewhat complex, but in a way they're not. But they're best explained by the videos. Most of the videos are usually in the duration of 3 minutes, and they'll discuss these things in pieces so that it can kind of form the puzzle of understanding that begins to put your arms around understanding this problem. It's and it's kind of a very largely misunderstood subject in our industry as professionals. And even as a pool pro that's been at this since '84, I struggled with it. I mean, when I first looked at this startup and I looked at high calcium, calcium is a 4-letter word to the average pool professional. It's a negative. I never saw calcium as a benefit, but I can tell you this right now. Calcium levels being higher in the pool and temperature are the two most misunderstood concepts that will fundamentally change in the next 20 years in the pool industry, and it will all be recognized in the future as being dinosaur thinking, that lowering calcium in the pool is a good thing because it will stop scale. It's completely not the case. Having said that, most of the damage professionals and homeowners are doing to their pools happen when their water looks the most benign. I always tell people aggressive water in a swimming pool looks beautiful. The sharper the water, the lower the pH, the more damage you can be doing to your pool. So don't be tricked into appearance as the barometer for how good your water is. Aggressive water, danger is lurking in clarity in the winter. And so monitor the LSI in the winter. Do not ignore your pool when you're not using it, because most of the things that can go wrong are happening while it's winterized or while you're circulating it in the winter. And that doesn't matter whether you live in California, Florida, or in New England. The same concepts are the same. The LSI does not know borders, it doesn't know countries. It's a universal concept. So it's critical that you maintain this LSI year round, especially when you think your pool doesn't matter.
Let's just touch a little bit on the metal staining in your actual product, the SC1000. How would that help in a situation if someone has scaling in their pool or metal stains in their pool?
So essentially, there's two forms of what we call chelation and sequestration. They're two different products. We don't provide a sequestrant, we provide a chelant. So sequestrants are products that cluster things. Think of cluster things and try to take them out of a pool. So in our case, a chelant is designed to isolate the molecule of a metal so that it can't be oxidized. So essentially, scale forms or stains on a wall happen because they oxidize the metals and they attach to the wall. And so essentially what our SC1000 does is it's a non-phosphorus. And by the way, this is a very important distinction. A great number, if not the vast majority, of sequestrants in the pool industry contain phosphates. And so when you use a phosphate-based product, all the conversations that we've had earlier, for example, when you put a phosphate remover in a pool and you've used a phosphate-based sequestrant, guess what? You're taking the sequest out of the water. So the product that you bought intended to do something is removed by the use of another product. Our product is compatible with phosphate control because it has no phosphates in it. It's also one of the few, if not the only, NSF certified non-toxic chelant that's in the pool industry that I'm aware of, and that could be others that I don't know about, but I know that was true at some point in time in the past. That can change. But so a chelant is designed to allow the metals to exist in the pool. It's not going to take metals out. Sequestrants will. A product that we think is a great product that actually removes metals, a product called See Later, and that product actually pulls metals out of the water, in particular iron and copper and I think zinc and manganese. So getting those metals out is a good thing. We don't do that. What we do is we take the metals that are in there and we isolate them so that they can be in an oxidizing environment and not plate or form. One of the places that scaling is most prevalent in an experience of the pool industry is in a salt cell system in the cell itself. And our SC1000 product will actually chelate calcium to the extent that it will minimize, if not eliminate, the formation of scale on a cell. So that's one of the real nuisance and interfering, and it's also an expense maintenance-wise. The titanium coating, or ruthenium, titanium cell with a ruthenium coating, which is what a salt cell has, is negatively impacted by acid washing, and that's one of the required steps sometimes in cleaning a cell. And so by using SC1000, you mitigate the use of acid to clean your cell, which then gives your cell a longer life. And ultimately, one of the things that I want to say about salt systems, and that could be a whole different podcast, is the less, back to the same thinking with cyanuric acid, the less that you operate, the better and more effective they are. And when they scale, they have to be operated at a higher level in order to have the same output. So the formation of scale on a cell also interferes in the formation of chlorine and the negative impacts that it has on the wear and tear of that unit. And the maintenance that's required to do that can shorten the life of that cell by peeling that ruthenium off that cell. And once that titanium touches water, it rusts and it's ruined. So the use of SC1000 in salt pool is one of the reasons I think SC was originally so broadly accepted, is that it's not adding to phosphates, and all of the salt manufacturers all recommend the removal of phosphates, part of the process of using a salt system. So if you have a salt pool out there, folks, number one, all your manufacturers are going to recommend the removal of phosphates as part of their maintenance requirement. And secondly, why would you put a phosphate-based sequestrant in a pool if it's ultimately going to have an impact on the performance of that system? So our SC1000 product allows for the use of a chelant that will help in not forming scale on the cell and still get the protection without the byproduct necessary when you use a phosphate-based sequestrant. So one pulls something out, the other just allows what's in there to stay.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time, Harold, recording all these podcasts, and I think the information is definitely necessary for the pool professional, and of course for the consumer, the homeowner. All this stuff translates to both, pool pros and homeowners who have a pool and want to protect their investment. And for the pool guys, they want to make sure they don't have any liability when they do startups or when they are maintaining someone's pool. So all of this is really crucial information. So I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for helping us highlight the things that we're doing out there, David. Your acknowledgement of our process as a company is an important one, because I think you're a very responsible fiduciary in our space, and we want to be. I think we've largely been acknowledged and recognized as the industry leader in helping the service trade. I think that people's willingness to take care of their own pool is a personal decision, and the reality is that we want to help both consumers and professionals, and we want our consumers to push our professionals to seek new solutions or more advantageous solutions. And by educating the consumer, the trade will be forced to change. And so those are all benefits, in my opinion, in the past, because old habits, if an old habit is a sound one, let's keep doing it. But, change is water today is very different than water of yesterday. And a lot of these things are explained by understanding. And so thanks for helping us with the why as much as or more than the what. So please seek us as a company for unbiased direction that are not going to be product driven in what we do. Most of the teachings, if not all the teachings, are predicated on just trying to be a responsible person in the world and trying to help people understand things that I've come to understand that I didn't know. And you would think a person that's been in the business as long as I have, that this wouldn't have been a shock to me that it was, but it took me a long time to get to a place of understanding that we have to rethink the way we're doing things, and we'll make our customers happier and we become more valuable in the end. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that's a lot of information for one podcast here, but I think the breakup, the talk on scaling and etching would have probably been prohibitive to you getting all the knowledge you need. So you can, of course, listen to this podcast again to get the information you need out of it, depending on your situation, what you're dealing with. And, of course, you can go to the Orenda website, orendatech.com, and you can pull up the videos and the various articles regarding scaling and etching. And the app that he mentioned in the podcast is available for download on their site for both your Apple and for the Android phone. And so you can use the LSI calculator, dosage calculator there to calculate the dose to balance your pool. I think it's a very helpful app. And if you wanted to hear the other podcast series on the water quality issues that I recorded here with Harold Evans, you can find it on my website at swimmingpoollearning.com. I also have the links available in the description here for you to click on the other parts of the series. And from my website, you can also click on the podcast icon. It'll take you to my podcast show, and you can, of course, listen to the other episodes in the series there. And if you do pool service for a living and you want to enhance your business, or you're just starting out, the coaching program would be a great way for you to get one-on-one help directly from me. You can learn more about the coaching program at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Leslie's Pool Supplies has been do-it-yourselfers and pool trade professionals' trusted partner since 1963, providing quality products and services to make pool care easy and solutions and expertise to do it right.